Hey guys, welcome to this episode of the podcast. So excited to share with you guys a really cool new journal that's coming out. I want to share with you guys. The Palisocs have written something that I think is just going to be really helpful for you in your personal journey, as well as you as a leader with your people. And so I want to introduce the Palisocs to you guys. So Nate, Alissa, thanks for jumping on. I want you guys to introduce yourselves real quick.
Yeah, man, we're glad to be here. Like what Ryan said, my name's Nate Palisoc and my wife, Alissa. And so we're just, glad and honored to share a little bit about what God's going on or what God's got going on. Yeah.
So you guys are pastors. You guys have been in ministry for quite a while. Youth ministry, leadership college, associate pastors, all kinds of stuff. Great ministry at the local church. And so you guys know exactly what it's like to be mom, dad, pastor, follower of Christ, all that kind of stuff. And so really excited that you guys are going to be sharing today. So I want to turn it over to you guys just a little bit. Tell us a little bit about what the start was for this journal. What is it? Tell us a little bit about how it kind of got started.
Yeah. So it actually got started, I want to say like 3 years ago. And I don't know, Nate and I have this tradition of going to our closet and praying. And so we have Nate would always hang up a lot of different scriptures. And there was one day, it was late at night, and I remember being in the closet just praying. And I was drawn to this scripture verse where it talked about remembering the things that the Lord has done, but not just us remembering them, but then passing them down to our children, and then our children passing them down to their children and their children and their children. And as I read that, I was like, man, I just felt so impressed with the Lord in that moment. You know, those moments where you just feel like the Lord shows up and it's like, you feel like you're really having a conversation with him. And I felt so intensely in that moment that the Lord wanted me to start something for our family right then, but as well as for other families. And that was just a journal that the only purpose of this journal would be to write in it when God does something incredible or a miracle or something amazing in your family's life that you want your children to remember the goodness of God through it. Yep. And so the whole idea of it at that moment was for us to begin to pass it down to actually my parents, to have them start it. And then we would then take it over and kind of write some of the things that God was doing, and then eventually pass it down to my daughter and have her write in it. And then it would just continue on this legacy of God's goodness. And gosh, there's so many benefits of it that I'm sure we'll get into later. But that was a couple of years ago. And I remember it was a great idea and I loved it. And then that was it. Nothing ever happened with it. And I was like
so many people, you have these great somebody needs to do that.
Yep. Yes, that would be awesome. And so, fast forward to, gosh, it was, I want to say like May or June of this year. And I was back in the prayer closet. It was 2 a.m. We were going through a rough season actually at that point. And I just remember crying out to the Lord. And at that moment, I felt, it was a rough moment. I felt like the Lord it was just convicting. And I felt like the Lord reminded me of that and said, what did you ever do with that? And I felt like what we were walking through in that moment, it would have been so great to have a journal like that we could look back on and look through all the things that God had done in our lives, because it was a rough season. And I felt convicted, but I also felt this urgency that the Lord said, get up and do it. And so that night, it was already 2 a.m, but I went and grabbed my laptop and I began to do research. And I remember you probably thought I was crazy, but I was on there for a couple hours just researching. And as parents, that's when we get things done in the middle of the night, because it's like the only time that, you really have time to get things done. So I was working away. And since then, it has been quite the process of, trying to figure out what type of journal and wanting it to be something that lasted. So we're getting like all leather and wanting it to be important. It was very important to both of us that it have quality and it be something that can last for generation to generation. So we spent a lot of time working on it, getting all the details done, and we're finally ready to launch. And so it's arriving. All of our journals are arriving mid-January, and we're excited. We're excited because I think, gosh, this is something that can be so transformational for our family. And then I get excited about all the other families that this can be transformational for. Because I think, a couple of things. One, I get excited because it's just going to catalog all of the things that God's done. And so when trials come, you just pull out this journal and you begin to see God's goodness time and time and time. And if God did it for you then, he'll do it for you again. If he did it for you then, he'll do it for you again. And when my daughter goes through something, I want her to be able to look back at this journal and see all the good things that God has done in our lives.
Yep.
And then, man, I just get so excited about my grandchildren, and I'm just a mom now, but you know what I mean? I just get excited for what that's going to be. And then, you know, too, another great benefit I see from it is just the faith that it builds, the expectancy. You know, you begin to write in it and you just begin to expect God to do something, because what you focus on is what you fuel. And so if I keep focusing on God's goodness, I just expect God's goodness to happen.
Yep.
And so even in that, it just kind of transforms like our thought life and into being, instead of being negative all the time or focusing on all the bad things, we begin to focus on all the good things and all of the good things that are happening around us that sometimes gets so clouded out because of the world we're living in right now. You know, so that's a little bit about, you know, the history of how it started.
I love it. I know that, especially for those that grew up, you know, in a deep history of faith, how cool is it to see, hey, you know, my great grandparents went through, you know, the Depression or whatever it was, but God like was faithful for them. And like, hey, my parents went through World War I or II, and like God was faithful to that. Or, hey, my grandparents, you can read like the story of just like their faith. And so it's like their stories, you know, it's like you said, like God was faithful to them. He can be faithful to you. And then your stories, I just know there's so many things for me that I've even forgotten that God did, right? Like there's so many times where I'm like, man, I remember God did something, but I don't remember what it was, right? You know what I mean? And it's
So true.
you know, and it's like, oh man. And then like God will remind me, you know, and it's like, oh yeah. Okay. You know what I mean? But like in that moment, like you said, you 2 a.m., rough season, you're down. I think emotionally it's easy to be really clouded, and those emotions cloud the memory. And so when you can pick up that journal, that book, and say, okay, there it is. And it's like, oh man, I remember. And I'm sure you guys are like a lot of us, where when you see your writing, it almost takes you right back to that moment, right? Of when you wrote it. So, you know, I've heard people say, you know, like, you know, like on the left side of the page, you write like what you're praying about. And on the right side of the page, you write like when God answered it. Is that kind of the thing? Or is this more of like after the fact, you go back and record it? Kind of how would you suggest it's kind of used?
That's great. I mean, honestly, it can be however you want it to be. We ended up leaving all of the pages blank except for some scriptures at the end, and then some passed down lineage for that very reason, because both of us like to write in our journals very differently, and we didn't want it to be like you have to do it a certain way. So that is great. How I envisioned it for our family is just writing down the miracles that God's done. So not necessarily asking and then seeing the results, but just like, this is what happened. You know, I was thinking back actually even today to my little brother had asthma and kept going back to the hospital, and a bunch of ladies prayed over this hanky, you know, back in the day, is what they called it. So they gave it to my mom, and she put it on my brother, and he never had asthma again. And we were in the hospital every week, you know, with him not being able to breathe, going from that to not, he's never had a problem since, you know. Just, I can't wait to put that in our journal, you know, things like that. Or even we were talking about some miracles from Nate's side too, with your mom. Share that.
Yeah, just with my mom, you know, a lot of stuff that we went through earlier on, and you know, it's a miracle that we are here today. And by here, I mean in America. Just, you know, there were a lot of things that happened where my mom wasn't a natural born U.S. citizen, but God moved. Like God moved heaven and earth to allow us to stay here. And then, like, you know, in all of that, He had a plan and a destiny for that as well too. So it's just crazy just looking back, and you know, kind of like what you guys are saying. It's just that, man, God does all these awesome and amazing things. And, you know, Ryan, like you're saying that, you know, like sometimes we just forget. And I remember when I used to teach, you know, some college students just about just different classes, you know, one thing I would say, because I would always get the question, Pastor Nate, you know, like, how come God doesn't speak to me? Like, I don't remember God ever speaking to me. Like, God just doesn't, like, what do I do for God to speak to me? And then my response would often be, it's not that God doesn't speak to us, it's just that we've forgotten that He's spoken to us already. You know, we do a bad job of remembering. So, you know, our remember function in our brain is whacked out, man. Like we remember all of the wrong things and we forget all of the right ones. You know what I'm saying?
So true.
So kind of like sociologists, say that you have to, man, you have to say like 7 positive comments for 1 negative comment. And, it's just crazy how that has to, it has to far outweigh the positive, has to far outweigh the negative. But it's so true that our brains are just caught up in the negative. And then so, just going along with what you guys said, just in helping us remember the good things that the Lord has done. We talk about being good stewards of our resources. We talk about being good stewards of our energy and of our time, but honestly, like we need to be good stewards of our memories as well too. And the things that the Lord's done there. And I think if we can be good stewards of that, that will deeply impact our faith and that will deeply impact the way that we view life, because we can remember the things that the Lord's done and will continue to do.
That's so good.
Yeah, I know, like a few years ago, my wife and I had some student loans, which, a lot of people do. And we had just been making like, we were youth pastors making, minimum payments. And we were just getting really frustrated at like, here we are, like teaching people to get out of debt and like, don't be in debt. And, but we've got all this debt from our student loans. And so we were just like, we're done. We're doing something right. And so our church was doing the Blessed Life series and this whole like God's outgive God type of a thing. And so like God did crazy miracles through that time of just paying off crazy amount of debt. I mean, just all these ways that you're just like, that doesn't make any sense. Like that doesn't happen, right? But like it did. And I can even remember like now looking back, there's a lot of like the specifics that I wish I would remember that I just don't, right? And it's like, oh man, like I remember some kind of the big pictures, but all those little details would have been so cool to have written down someplace, like a journal, so that I could go back and remember like all the little things and not just the big picture, right? But all the little things along the way that I could really pass on to my kids or even myself. Like you said, what I'm feeling down, because there's probably going to be another season where, man, I really need God to financially provide, right? And in that moment, I can go back and be like, oh yeah, okay, I remember, this is what we were feeling, this is what we were praying, and this is what we were desiring, this is what God did. And so, man, I just love the idea that you can be specific, you can have all those details written down. One of my favorite books is Henry Blackaby's Experiencing God. And he talks about in there creating spiritual markers in your life, these places that you can come back around to. And like in the Old Testament, right? Like they'd build altars or they'd like pile rocks up so that every time they came around, they could remember the goodness of what they did. And I think that you guys even kind of mentioned that concept. So you want to maybe unpack that a little bit too? Because I think you guys mentioned that.
Yeah, like in Joshua, like what you're saying, Joshua chapter 4, man, it talks about how when the Israelites crossed the Jordan River, they were about to enter into the promised land. And man, it's the fulfillments of their destiny, that this is what the Lord has for the children of Israel. And so it's kind of like how, Christmas morning, your kids are waiting for the gifts and they're like, yeah, come on, man, just give it to me. I really want to get there. And what happens is that when the children get up for the gifts and they unwrap everything, they go crazy, they go buck wild. They're like, yeah, this is awesome. And it's really cool that they enjoy those gifts. But what's even better is that if the children can remember from whom they came from, and then that way they're able to thank, the giver of the gift. And what's really cool is that, in that story, where the Israelites are about to cross over, the Lord says, hey, listen, I know human tendency. And I know that you're going to get on over and you're going to enjoy this thing. You're going to, because rightfully so, it's the promised land. But it's really cool that God says, but listen, I want you though to remember this moment, because I dried up the Jordan River. I was faithful to you in the desert for the past 40 years. I delivered you out of Egypt. And so commemorate this moment by setting up these rocks. That way, as your kids and their future kids, are enjoying the benefit and the fruits of the promised land, they'll look at this and they'll remember, oh yeah. I'm not going to take this for granted, because man, we had to work. God had to work hard, and God didn't work hard, but man, God took us from a long way to get to where we are now. And then it just makes you even more thankful for the blessings that you do have when you can remember from whence they came from and how hard, how difficult they were to get there. So yeah, man, it's just that same exact concept. And just one more quick story, that I can think of right off the top of my head is, I think of when David slew Goliath, and everybody loves that story. Everybody talks about how he hurled the stone, and then afterwards, David was a gangster, and so he pulled out Goliath's sword, and then he beheaded the giant.
He used his own sword.
That's right, bro. David was an OG back in the day, probably from Long Beach, California. But what gets lost, though, what a lot of people don't talk about is the following verse where it talks about how David took Goliath's armor and put it in his own tent.
Yeah.
And when I think about that, like if you just imagine that, because a lot of these Bible stories, you read it, you glaze over it, but just live there, live in the moment. Imagine David being a young man, and he gets up early in the morning and he has to go through his day. He has to face whatever he has to face, whether as king, warrior, whatever else. But imagine feeling discouraged when you wake up and you're like, man, I don't know if I can go through another day. But all of a sudden you open up your eyes and you see Goliath's armor in the corner of your tent. And then you remember that miracle that the Lord did for you. Oh man, that changes your perspective on things right away. Yeah. And then so if you can look at these different things that the Lord's done, not just glaze over them, but if you can remember them, they change your perspective. They breed courage. They breed inspiration. They breed faith. And so, man, we just think that remembering is just really one of the key things that you can do. And that's why we're so passionate about this.
Yeah. If I could jump in too, because I was just thinking almost the opposite of that when Joshua and Caleb were sent as spies to go into the promised land. Mm-hmm. And the rest of, I always look at the Israelites, I'm like, how do you not get it? Like, God is so good. Do you not remember his faithfulness? Like, as you read it, you just look at them and like, you're so dumb. But then you think about your own life and you're like,
I'm so dumb.
Okay.
Yeah, I got you.
Got it. But I just wonder, man, if they would have stopped to remember all the miracles. Providing manna from heaven. A cloud by day. Fire by night. I'm going, what the heck? Like, those are some pretty awesome things. Right. If you would have just remembered those in that moment, mm-hmm. you would have looked at that a totally different way. And maybe you wouldn't have had to wander in the desert for 40 more years, like what would have happened. And almost then I think about it for us, like, man, Lord, help us to have enough faith that when you call us to do something, that we are not so scared and timid because we don't trust and have faith in you to be able to do whatever it is that you've called us to do. Yeah. And so for us to be able to look back at God's goodness and be able to charge full force going in and saying, God, you've got this. Like, you've got this. Mm-hmm. Like, this is what you called me to do. Like, I'm not scared, and I think, man, if the Israelites could have done that, but then I think, man, if we could do that, because we all have those same tendencies of forgetting time and time again. I love what you said earlier. We always forget, all the things that we should remember. Mm-hmm. And we remember all the things that we should honestly forget. Yeah. But yeah.
Yep.
And so it reminds me of sports, right? We've all said, like, nothing means less than the score at halftime, right? You know what I mean? And so it's kind of like, I think there's so many times when coaches will point back, hey guys, remember 3 weeks ago, we were down by 21 and we came back in the second half. Yes. Hey, remember before, right? And it's like that, you can come back to like that locker room moment of like, hey, let's look back. I know we feel defeated right now. I know we feel weak right now. I know we feel like we don't have faith right now. Like, let's look at the history. Like, let's look back at that and go back into the second half. And, the other thing I think of too, it reminds me of too, with sports again, is there's often times where, we'll watch like USC, UCLA just played, right? And they talk about like the history of the game. And they're like, USC has won so many of these times, or UCLA has won this many times. And it's like, well, these players, they weren't even born when they're talking about that. But yet those players still feel like they're a part of that legacy. They feel like they're a part of that history. They feel like they're being drawn into that because they're a part of that family. And so like, when you look at your little, grandkids, right? And it's like, yeah, they weren't a part of that story, but that story is a part of their life. The other thing, reminds me too of like, how cool is this? I pray that no one experiences this moment, but unfortunately there's times where people's kids don't follow the Lord, right? And then they can hopefully like look at a journal like this and not just look at the Bible and say, well, the Bible, but it's like, man, look at what God did in my family, like my grandparents and my great grandparents. And it's like, man, that's really tough to like try and defeat that. Cause it's like, trying to attack the Bible, right? Like, Nate, like I get that, but it's like, man, like God provided all those things. That's tough, you know? And so I think there's just so many different angles to come at this.
So true.
That
and even Ryan, like the angle of just our season that we're going through right now, man. I mean, we all know that when you're in the middle of a season, you know, your view is so subjective. And like when you're in the middle of a season, you feel like it's the worst, it's the biggest, it's the most, you know, whatever extreme word you want to say there. But, you know, if you had something where you can look at a journal and zoom out and give you a bigger perspective on things, like I wish that this journal was around decades ago and that our parents could have written about it. Because, you know, I'm thinking of, you know, man, just even recent history, like Y2K. Remember when that was a big deal? Like people thought the world was going to shut down. Everything's going to reset. Y2K. You had a mini recession there, you know, in the early 2000s. And then after that, you had 9/11, you know, you had 9/11 happen also like around that same era. You know, you had H1N1 and all this other stuff, man. And so it's just crazy because we've lived through those seasons before, you know, and it was tough then, but man, but God's got us through it. And this is just another season, but when you're in the middle of the season, man, it's hard to see through the trees. And if you can just have something to look back on and give you some objective perspective and say, oh, you know what? I've lived through worse. I'm okay. It's all good. You know, and then that way the spirit of fear and whatever else, man, isn't that big and that heavy on you if you can just get some objectivity to your perspective.
So good. So we talked before we started recording kind of this idea that it's, man, this isn't just for you and your family, but many people listening are ministry leaders. So, I mean, it seems to me like there's so many applications for ministry leaders to like bring this into their church. Any tips or suggestions on kind of that front?
Yeah, I know, and you had kind of mentioned this too, but I think it's an excellent idea as far as like small groups to go through it. I know there's a group of moms that are going to be meeting at our house on Wednesday nights, and for us to go through it as moms, even just to be able to encourage each other and build each other's faith. Well, I'm really excited about that, but even as far as just your congregation, just I can't even imagine, like, I just think about what if all of us began to write down, I don't even care if you buy our journal, just begin to write down God's goodness, begin to write down God's miracles. If all of us begin to just focus on that, I just can't imagine what that would do to our churches, what that would do to the Christian faith. I just see it exploding. I just see our faith growing and God being able to do more and more and more than he's ever been able to do before. And all these, you know, with COVID happening and all these things that are kind of happening around us that can be scary, man, how much better would it be, the church, for us to be the difference, for us to be able to have joy and hope when nobody else around us does? Why can't we be different, you know, right now? Why can't we stand up above the rest right now? And I just think about, gosh, if we could just begin to think about all of the things that God is doing right instead of all the things that are going on around us that are just wrong, it would just really change things for us. So those are just a couple thoughts.
And then I think too, for ministry leaders in particular, you know, we talk about spiritual disciplines. We talk about fasting and praying. You know, we talk about daily Bible reading. We talk about being involved in community, you know, and all these other things that we talk about, they're great. But I feel like that in this season, man, especially as we continue to advance in our culture, you know, one of the spiritual disciplines that we neglect and that we often don't even know it exists is, man, the spiritual act of reflection, taking time just to sit back and reflect on the different things that the Lord's already spoken to you and the different things the Lord's done and examining everything. So, you know, we live in a very consumer driven culture where consume every information you can get, consume every podcast you get, consume. But man, but consumption without reflection is nothing. And then so it's about reflecting on those things already. And so I just think as ministry leaders, if we can get into the habit of, you know, not every day, but maybe, you know, once a week or a couple times a month, you know, just getting a good solid hour, you know, at the most, you know, we can get that in, that's great, you know, but an hour where we can sit back and then where we can journal, we can look through our journal, we can say, all right, man, let's reflect and let's see the things that the Lord has done already. And man, how often, you know, ministry leaders, man, it's tough, you know, being a pastor is tough, but, you know, in Psalms, it says that David encouraged himself in the Lord. And I think as ministry leaders, if you can get the habit of journaling, but also reflecting and thinking on the good things that the Lord has done already in your life, that's one way that we can encourage ourselves in the Lord as well too. And hopefully if we do that, it helps tip the scales in our favor that we don't give up so easily. We don't quit,
Really
so we got to keep on going if we want to reap a harvest, but we've got to be willing to stay in the game for that. And I think that's one way that can really help us.
How cool would it be to be able to just look back and to not just hear about your parents' struggle to like have a
Right.
child, right? But to be able to read their tears and their heartache and their pain, and then to read how God was faithful to like give them a child, and you're that child that's reading this, right? I mean, just how much, I just think it's so powerful to be able to read it. And it's not just this like story that's told, but like to really read in depth that story and that struggle, and to see it and to heal. I just think it's so powerful that you can pass that on. So, okay, so let's, how do they get this? Where are they going? What's the next steps?
Yeah, so legacyline.org is the website. You can go on there, and anyone listening to the podcast, you guys, we have a special discount for you guys. Roundtable is all you need to enter in, and that will just be all one word. We'll just combine that. So roundtable, and then that'll get you 10% off the site. And so you can go there, check out the journal. We'll have other things coming eventually, but right now we're just starting out with the journal, and we're excited about it. We also have an Instagram page called Your Legacy Line. And our goal through even our Instagram page is just to bring faith and hope and joy in the midst of the season. So launching in January, we're hoping to have testimonies every week of God's goodness. So that way we can just flood Instagram with God's faithfulness.
Yeah, I would encourage you guys, jump on, grab a hold of that. Let's partner with this great opportunity to just really leave a legacy. I know in leadership, we always talk about like when we're passing the baton on to like, a new senior leadership or a new youth pastor, whatever. And it's like, man, let my ceiling be their floor. Right.
That's good,
and a lot of times we talk about that in our faith, or in our leadership, but this is really setting that up for your faith and saying, man, let the ceiling of my faith be my kids' a floor, and let them continue to build, as opposed to them having to like start over in their own faith walk. It's like, I don't know, let me pass that on, and we're going to keep going, and so I just love this concept. Love the idea. So thankful. I know you guys have put a lot of time, energy, and effort into making this happen. So thank you guys, because I think it's also encouraging to so many people that are listening, because I know there's a lot of people listening right now, and maybe we can kind of wrap up with this, but just there's a lot of people that have had those ideas, right? That thought, that Shark Tank idea, right? And so maybe you could just give a little bit of encouragement to that person that has had that idea. What took you? I mean, you talk about a little bit of that prayer, but and being kind of convicted, but it took action too, right? So maybe you can give just a little bit of encouragement to someone who's got that same thought.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, grit is the word that I would use, because there was so many setbacks for this journal. I cannot tell you week after week, things that I had no idea how to do. And I just kept pushing forward. And I think at the end of the day, I knew deep down in my heart that the Lord really was calling us to do this. And I think that pushed me forward. But there was a level of grit that I had to have, that when things didn't work out, like I went through, I think 3 or 4 companies, and went through the whole process all over again with all of them. And I just wanted to be done. I'm like, this just clearly is not working, And then, we get sent journals that I wanted like a really nice leather. And so I think we finally got it. And they send me this journal that the leather was awful. I'm not even sure it was real. And so I'm like, oh my gosh, we're starting all over again. And I honestly wanted to quit, wanted to give up, wanted to let's just wait another year. All of these things that I kept saying. And then I just kept, feeling that impression from the Lord, but also just that grit at the end of the day. No, we're doing it. We're going to push past. And then what I kept telling myself was, okay, wait for the next one. You're ready. There's going to be something's going to happen. It's going to get messed up. Get ready for it. Like I just psyched myself up for it, that I was ready for it. So, I mean, whatever it is that God's calling you to do, it doesn't matter. If he's called you to do it, it will happen. So just keep pushing past the hurdles, keep pushing past the unknowns. Google is a great resource. Friends are great resources, just push past everything. and just do, I think at the end of the day, I just said to the Lord, I'm going to do the best that I can,
Yeah.
but I need you to come through for me. And so I'm giving you everything that I've got. Here you go. And I'm praying that that's enough. And so I'm just being faithful with the part that he's given me to do and having the grit to finish it and then allowing him just to do the rest.
That's good. And if I could just add one little thing to that is, along with every venture, there's always like some sort of capital risk, some sort of financial investment.
Yeah.
I know for us, like what you said, Ryan, man, we're in ministry. And so we're not in it to make the money. And so, so we want to be wise stewards with that stuff. But, I think when it came down to it, it's all a matter of how you viewed it. And then, so for a lot of people, when they hear that we invested our own capital into it, they're like, man, well, that's risky. Well, what's going to be your return? And then, and Wayne and people were trying to get us to weigh that stuff out. And honestly, just your perspective is you can either view it as a risk. Hey, I'm investing in this. This is going to be a risk. I don't know what I'm going to get back. And then, so if it's a risk, you weigh your pros and your cons. Mm-hmm. But the second way that you can view it is you can view it as either obedience or disobedience.
Yeah.
And, at the end of the day, we really felt like this is what the Lord's telling us to do. Yeah. So to us, it's not risk. It's not win or lose. It's, do we obey or do we not obey?
Yeah.
And regardless of what happens, whether we get to recoup some of that back or whatever else or how it goes, at the end of the day, if we were just obedient, then that's it. That's all we want to do. So I would say just ask yourself that too. Is it a risk that you're trying to weigh out, or is it an obedience issue? And if it's an obedience issue, and if you're a Christian, you don't have much choice there. So.
Yeah, I love that. I think there's that really deep question of is this really what Lord's calling me to do?
Yeah.
Right.
Because if I don't do it, it's actually an act of disobedience by not doing it. And so really spending that time in prayer and getting to that point where you just feel like, man, this burden, this call, this, this is a calling for me. And so I want to encourage all you guys, take some risk. And that's the other thing. The ironic thing about that is that that's going to be in the journal, right? Like the creation journal is going to be in the journal,
so
right?
True.
Yeah.
So true.
You know what I'm saying? So, but I think that's the other thing that this does is it allows you to see, man, remember that when we took a big step and we gave $50 that we didn't have to a missionary, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then God blessed us. And now it's like, man, maybe we have more faith to give $100, right? And so God was faithful to return that $50, right? And so whatever it is, you start small and you just keep building and building and building and watch God's faithfulness and watch the legacy of God and your family get passed on. So good. So good.
Yeah.
Love it, guys. Any final thoughts or anything you want to share with us before we wrap up?
No, man, that's it.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for having us. It's been awesome. We love sharing about it. I think if anything, we just love the idea of building each other's faith in the body of Christ. And so at the end of the day, if we could have done that today, I think we did what we were called to do.
Amen. Yep.
Awesome.
Thanks so much, Ryan.
Yeah. Thanks guys for jumping on. And again, one more time, give us the website one more time.
Legacyline.org.
Go get it, guys. And let's pass on the legacy and the goodness of God. We'll see you next time.
All right. See you guys.
See ya.